I'm your host, Lee Adams, and today we have such a special guest with us today. I'm very excited. When you think of Pittsburgh, what do you think? My guess is a lot of people, a lot of votes would go to the Steelers. When you think of the Steelers, what do you think? Well, a lot of great players, a lot of Hall of Fame players, some Hall of Fame coaches, but the first family of the Steelers is the Rooney family. My special guest here today is part of the Rooney family. He was the architect of some of the greatest Steeler drafts in Steeler history and also notable in NFL history. He's also the author of Rooney, the story of Art Rooney and his clan. Please let me introduce Mr. Art Rooney Jr. Hi, Mr. Rooney. How are you?
Hi, Lee. I'm fine.
It's great to have you here today. Now, where was the idea from this book? Where did the idea come from?
Oh, about 3 decades, 3 decades ago, we were still in the Roosevelt Hotel. We had not yet, of course, moved to Three River Stadium. That would come like the next year. And one of the writers from Sports Illustrated was coming in to interview my dad, and I was then working in the personnel department. It was a department of one, me, and we had the Blesto scouting group, you know, that we got most of our work done with. And so it was kind of the off season, and Mort Sharnick from Sports Illustrated came in to do my dad in an interview, and Dad was at Mass. He went to Mass every morning. Then he'd go into the Strip District, maybe Parantes or something, and have breakfast. And so he wasn't late. It was just that Sharnick was early. And so they assigned me to show the visiting fireman for the fire chief around. You know, we really didn't have many interviews from Sports Illustrated in those days. So anyways, Mort came in, and I showed him my office in my scouting department in the back of the Roosevelt Hotel, and it was really in the bowels of the hotel. I mean, we kept on going through doors and all that stuff, and he got back there and he said, "My Lord," he said, "I can see that you're not impressed with big offices." I said, "No, the only thing you have to do is get the job done. The office is not important." And then these people started to come back to visit me. It was almost like it was rehearsed, but it wasn't. They were just part of the scenery. You know, old Doc C.K. was the steward dentist, and he had played for Jock Sutherland at Pitt. And they say he had the strongest hands for a dentist in Pittsburgh, but he, you know, hygiene and things like that weren't so important to Doc C.K. And I mean, he'd drop the tooth that he's putting in somebody's mouth, you know, on the floor, and pick it up and wipe it off and then put it in. You know, he's gone, long gone, but he and I were great friends. I wouldn't want to hurt his feelings or any of his family's feelings on that. But another time, C.K. had an office off Shenley Golf Course, you know, out in Oakland, and a kid came in to get his teeth fixed, and he told the kid, he said, "You like golf, kid?" And he says, "Yeah." He said, "What do you think of coming to the dentist?" He said, "Oh, doctor, I'm so scared." He said, "Don't worry about anything. Let me see your mouth." And he gave a cursory look to his mouth, and he said, Doc said, "Your teeth are all right. Come on, I'll give you $1." So they opened the back window up and climbed out onto the golf course, and he went and played 2 holes, and this kid was his caddy, and they came back in. Of course, he gave the kid $1, and he showed him the outside office, and you know, then took the next patient in. But that was the kind of guy he was. And then the next visitor was a guy named Patsy Scanlon, who had been a real top boxer in Pittsburgh and fought like Harry Greben, those real good fighters. And Sharnick knew him. I mean, knew about him, and it was because he had covered boxing for Sports Illustrated, and he was thrilled to meet him. And then out in the hall, we met Sam Leone, a boyhood friend of my dad's, was a minor card player, gambler, and things like that. You know, always playing the horses and always getting in trouble. And then we saw my Uncle Jim, who was going into the restaurant, and he was a real character. He had played for Jock Sutherland at Pitt too, and was a friend of CK's. And so we went in there, and he started to tell. He held court for us. And then my father came in, and my father got me on the side, and he says, "We really don't introduce Jim to all these people like this. You know, you have to sort of keep him under wraps." You know? Well, Sharnick was completely taken with these guys, and over the years he would come back, and he told me, he says, "My golly," he says, your dad has more characters here than Damon Runyon does on Times Square and 42nd Street." He says, "You know, you have to start taking notes on all this stuff." And as the years went by, it went from notes to keeping journals or to do what you're doing, you know, recording and that. But I was too busy writing scouting reports about football players, how fast they backed and turned, and how they got to jump on the ball, and would they strike the rising blow, and all of that kind of stuff. But finally, my father had passed away, and I turned 60, and it was like 10 years after he died, and there was no Chief, the play, or the Chief by O'Brien, and none of these books had been written. And I thought, well, at 60, maybe I should start doing something. So I started writing these in journals. And, I had a journal, I had a North Side, about the North Side people journal, I had a football journal, and, just putting notes and things like that. And I did it for, it must have been 7 years or so. And my brothers decided that somebody was going to write a book about the Chief, my dad. And you never called him the Chief. The family never called him the Chief.
What did you
Behind
call
his back, Dad, Your Majesty. I'm just kidding, of course, but it's always Dad. But behind his back, you called him the Chief. But the people in the office, or the coaches, never called him the Chief. It was Mr. Rooney or things like that. But the press and the people that didn't really know, we call him the Chief. But I lost my point now. Where were we?
Well, no, you were talking about Mort Sharnick.
Yeah.
He's the guy that
from
talked.
Sports Illustrated. He pushed us, encouraged me. Always. I was talking to him the other day. He was so pleased that I wrote this book.
Yeah.
He said, "There all those years," and he said, "You had this story inside you." He said, "I did nothing except facilitate it." But finally, getting back to that now, and the brothers, Dan, thought that we should get a book started on it by somebody that we wanted to write it. And so Dan asked Gene Collier and Roy McHugh to come talk to me. And they came out to my office out here in the South Hills. And they came out 2 or 3 times. And by that time, I had started to take these stories and had my secretary type them up. And they were really raw. I write as I speak. Now, you've had a little sample of that so far. So you can see how these journals would be written. And I can't spell cat. Bradshaw had that reputation, but it was the truth with me. And I tried to give you a 3-syllable word before we started, and I butchered it, and you gave me the right pronunciation, and I could never give it again. But anyways, Collier told me, I gave him some of this stuff, and he said, and Roy McHugh too, and Collier came back and he says, I'm not ready to write a book, and I'll get your information back. And I said, no, let's keep it. I was wanting to get the story out, the story of my dad, preserve it and get it out. And because Sharnick kept on telling me that, these stories will disappear. The third generation, they won't even know about your dad and these guys, these stories. And so I told Collier to keep them. He may have some use for it. And of course, later he used a lot of that stuff. That's what he says, anyways, for his play of the Chief. But Roy McHugh was 88 years old then, and he had been the sports editor of first a writer in 1947. He came to town, and then the sports editor of the press, and then a columnist at large. You could write on anything you wanted. And he said, I've read this stuff. He said, it's real good. He said, I can help you to reorganize it. And he told me what I just told you. He said, you write as you speak. It's unique and kind of interesting, but you kind of have to civilize it. Now, civilize is my word. He used another word. I don't remember what it was. And, so it's more readable. So we started. It was not even going to be a book. It was just taking these stories I had and getting them in some type of order in the journals I had. And ultimately, we got in the back of envelopes, napkins, a little bit of dictation, but really, I have about 41 of these journals. And he thought that maybe some small town newspapers, they're looking for things, might want to publish some of these stories. And then a little bit later, he worked with me for 4 years. He said, I think there's a book here. And it took 4 years, and he told me when we decided to do that, you go extend it into a book. He says, well, he said, I got some age. He was 88 when we started. He was probably about 89 then. And he said, I got some age on me. He said, but I can still get the ball over the plate. He said, I still have a little steam on it. And he says, no, and then I can even get a curve over the plate. And so we did it, and I would stop writing. And he says, we're going to finish this thing. And I'm, 89 years old. He said, Christmas is coming. We have to, get going on this thing. So, I mean, he was remarkable and phenomenal. And Roy would take like a sentence, I'd allude to something, just, that I just recall. And he says, when I came to town, he says, like the Jock Sutherland there, he said, I remember stories about that. And he said, I may be able to, extend that a little bit. And he would take like a sentence and make it, a little paragraph. And if it was a paragraph, he'd make it 2 paragraphs. And then they'd come into me and say, gee, I covered that story as a young guy. He said, then we'd discuss it and that stuff. And he would, build on it and that. And that's one of the things that happened, how this thing grew.
Do you think you could have done this book without Roy McHugh?
Oh, no way. I don't think so. I think that we could have done something with an editor, because I did, like I say, ended up with 41 journals and a lot of bric-a-brac around, but no way, hey, listen, you said I was the architect of the Stewart stuff and that. I had the greatest help. One thing I did, I kind of had a knack. Roy was pure luck, but getting guys to work with me, Scots and things like that. And I wasn't afraid of someone taking my job. My dad owned the team. I mean, I just tried to get the best people to work with me. I think that I could have got someone else, but there's only one Roy McHugh.
Yeah. And how old is he now?
He's 93, and
93.
We're going into our 3rd printing of this book. And I wasn't even going to make one, I was going to print it out, but I wasn't going to, sell it or anything. But now we're going into the 3rd today. The day I talked to Roy on the phone, and I got to go ahead because he keeps on editing, the misspellings and things like that. And I got to go ahead from him. He had gone over the changes he went in the 3rd. I don't know if you call it 3rd edition, but 3rd printing anyways, and just called the printer and says, give us 3,000 more books.
Now, that's great. Now, this book has been described as a love letter to your father.
That's what Tom Atkins, who plays my dad, said that. And,
what do you think of that? Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, I guess it is. Even though I did study drama, at Carnegie Tech in those days, and a couple of studios in New York, but I was also in the Marine Corps. We're tough guys like John Wayne and that stuff. We don't say love letters and that stuff, but I guess maybe that was what it was. I was trying to preserve the story. It's my dad's story through my eyes and my ears. And another little aside on that stream of consciousness stuff, I'm afraid all the Irish get into. But I forgot what I was going to say. I'm glad you're cropping this stuff.
That's okay, but we're talking about the characterization of a love letter to your father.
My dad, and it's through my eyes, and as I say, my brother Dan said he knew my dad better than I did, and Tim I did know him, and that's the truth. That doesn't hurt my feelings. The only thing is I listened to every word he said, and I watched him, and so I think I was willing to record it.
Yeah.
And I told Tim, I said, Tim, you really do know these stories better than I do, and I think you can kind of verbally tell them better than I can. I said, but you have to write them down. And Dan did write a book down, but it's the same subject, although it's more about him. But it's a different way of telling the story.
Has your brother Dan read your book?
Dan has never read my book, and I have never read his, and I don't think he intends to read mine. And I might read his sometimes. I don't want to. I'm afraid if I read it, I'll be all second guessing myself, And my wife read Dan's book.
Yeah.
And
What did she say?
She thought it was a good book.
Yeah.
And she thought it was more about him than my dad, where she thought my book really, I do become one of the main players in it, but it's more about
Yeah, it is
Dad
about, a lot about your dad.
And Roy read both of the books, and he thought the same thing. And they both think Dan has a good book. Heck, it's going to sell 20,000 copies.
Well, now for people that don't know, how many children were in your family?
We had 5 sons in our family. Dan was the oldest. I was second. Then Tim's after me. Then the twins, Pat and John, are next.
And where did each son find their place as far as work?
Well, this is a very, very interesting and kind of an important thing at this stage of the game with us. Dan went to work for the Stewards while I was in college. I did that after I got out of drama school and that stuff, and went to the Marine Corps and that. And Dad knew that there was only enough room. And the Stewards were a lot smaller in those days, but still, there was only enough space for 2 of us to work. There was really 3, him and 2 of his sons. And he had been a racetrack guy and a gambler at the tracks and that stuff, and he knew that business. He knew that business better than anyone, really. And he got us into a few racetracks. It started out with through Governor Lawrence. They started pari-mutuel betting here in Pennsylvania, and he got us a piece of a track. So Tim had been a stockbroker here in town, and the twins, Pat was a copper salesman, and John was a school teacher up in Plum Barrow, and coach. And so he got really, the way it happens is kind of interesting. He got me a job working at one of those racetracks, the first one up at Liberty Bell Park in Philadelphia. And I never even lasted until they, the first race. They were building the track and that stuff, and I was still working for the ball club. And I told my dad, I said, I don't want to be a racetrack guy. I'm going to be a football guy. And
You knew that early on.
I mean, way early on. And I told, and I had started to, hang out with in the off season with the Scots. Well, we never had real full-time Scots, but the assistant coaches were Scots, and I got intrigued with it. And I asked my dad, can I be a Scot? And he said, it's one of those things, who would ever want to be a Scot, but okay, but you're all away from home a lot, that was a problem. But John was a school teacher, and Pat, the copper salesman, went to work at the racetrack in Philadelphia. And Tim was a stockbroker, and through the racetrack in Philadelphia, we had opportunities for my dad, the strong contact he had in Palm Beach, Florida, to get the Palm Beach Kennel Club. That's a dog track, greyhound track. And so Tim went to work down there. He left being a stockbroker. And we had a real guru. Let me get a drink of water here. A real financial guru, a guy named John McCartney from Philadelphia. He was a true Philadelphia lawyer. He was really a University of Pennsylvania guy, really a sharp little guy, and sharp as it could be. And he was cobbled into our group by Governor Lawrence. We had Dan Parrish was a contractor here, and my dad. They owned the majority of the stock, and another little group that was into the horse showing and racing, but they were sort of fancy dudes. And McCartney was their representative, and someone else, but they were. Herb Barness. He's a big Republican. The Democrats had this thing, and I think they had to throw this racing. They had to throw a Republican in, so they threw Herb in. Well, it's interesting. The biggest troublemakers were these little fancy horse guys up in Devon, PA. And McCartney was their lawyer. My dad was a genius at things like this. He ended up winning McCartney over, and he became our lawyer. and then ultimately became our partner for 15 years. You know, I mean, that was just the way my father was. You know, and
one of the themes in your book is your father wins a lot of people over.
Oh my gosh,
he just had that way about him.
Yeah, and Barnes, was the token Republican, but powerful. And my dad was a Republican. He was the most democratic Republican you ever met in your life. You know, and he ended up with Barnes. He became our partner too. You know, but I'm just saying that to show how my father was. You know, but Tim, was still a broker, but McCartney was the guy that came up with this Yonkers Raceway. You know, and we bought that Yonkers Raceway for about $48 to $50 million. That was a lot of money 40 years ago. You know, and my brother John said he was on a turnpike, and he knew. John worked at Liberty Bell up in Philadelphia, but he was taking his kids somewhere. He had a whole slew of kids, and he was on the turnpike, and we're going to get off, and he didn't have any money, and they had to search through the car. He and his 5 kids were, for enough change to get there. It wasn't big, it was like 40 cents. And he says, and just then it came on the radio, the Rooney family from Pittsburgh has bought Yonkers Raceway in New York for $50 million. He said, I didn't have enough dough to get off the turnpike. We were scrambling. The kids had money through the car, a dime here, a nickel there. But John had helped, on that deal, but he didn't know it had, it had been culminated,
So
I hope you don't mind me jumping around.
No, that's okay. The Rooney family has the Yonkers racetrack in New York.
Yeah, they had Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. They raced there at Liberty Bell.
Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Yeah. And then the dog track in
Palm Beach County.
So that's the 3
McCartney
tracks.
had really been a major player in the Kennel Club and the New York thing. But my father, the only reason we got the place down in Palm Beach, and we still have it, is because my father was friendly with the people that owned it, and then Yonkers, in New York that was the biggest standardbred track in the world at that time. Yeah.
Now you have some really high quality artwork in this book.
Oh yeah.
And who's responsible for that?
Well, the artwork is primarily from an artist who just recently died named Merv Corning, and he was like the preeminent football artist going, and I realized I was going to buy a seascape by him. We were out on vacation in San Diego, in Old Town. They had a gallery that showed his stuff, and we were going to buy a seascape, and someone bought it right before us, and so when I saw he had these football pictures, and I just started buying them, and finally Corning called me up. He says, I don't know you. He said, but you're buying a number of my paintings. And they were like $700 to $1,000 in those days. I was starting to get a little expendable income then, And he said, you might as well deal with me rather than the gallery, because, I'll give you a break on it. And so we never really met each other. We became really good friends, and I think his widow told me that I have 41 of his paintings, and he had 10 commissions from my brother Tim and I when he died. It was really sad. He was dying. I call him every week, and his voice would get weaker each week, and finally he says, I'm not going to make it more than a few months. He says, and when that doctor told me I probably won't be able to paint anymore, he said the only thing I thought of, he says, I have all those paintings for the Rooney boys to do. And he says, and I'll never finish Lynn Swan. And he was working on a picture of Lynn. But he was just a phenomenal painter. And then I had a couple other guys, like a local guy, Dino Gerino. We used to have a lot of fun just doing sketches. The football players that I liked, and some of the guys I drafted and that stuff. And so when we did the book, my cousin, Kathy Rooney Sokolowski, I called her up and see if she could help me out, and she came up with like the Corning pictures, of the baseball pictures on the front, and the Great American Sportsman's pictures on the back, and all these various pictures that she she put them all together.
Well, it's
she
great.
put all the, and really, you know, and Corning's widow saw that what she was doing, and she said, "My gosh, this gal's a magician with with Merv's paintings." And,
Absolutely great.
Yeah, she really has a talent, doesn't she? You know, and,
Absolutely. Now,
I'm very happy of that because everyone thinks of the Rooneys are strictly a bunch of jocks and things like that.
Yeah.
But, we have some people with talent.
Yeah, I'd say. Now, can you give a general description of your father as a kid? The kind of athlete he was, the kind of person he was, the ways that he spent his time.
He was he grew up in that first ward over there on the north side. You know, they had the Phipps apartments. My dad had his dad had a bar there. You know, he had been a steel worker and worked on river boats, and his wife, Grandma Rooney Murray, her name is Murray, were coal miners, and so they ended up with this bar over on the north side of Pittsburgh in the first ward. That's where the stadium's at now. You know, Three Rivers and PNC and Heinz Field, and he sort of catered to that sports group. You know, and the horse players and all that sort of stuff, and the politicians and they had a playground there, and my dad and his brothers, they just were good at that. They were good athletes, and they had time, and they put all their time into that, and it was a real tough neighborhood. And I think the thing that kept them from not being bad guys was their religion was so important. They all went up to St. Peter's School, and the sports, you know, the athleticism. And the three older ones, my dad, Dan, and Jim, were real good athletes. Real, I mean, and my dad used to tell us what a great athlete he was. And you know, you're little kids, you believe it, then you get skeptical, get older, and finally, you know, we were beyond skeptical. Yeah, he couldn't have been that good. And then when you start to do the research on these books and that, you find out it was the truth. In fact, some of this stuff is even better than he told it. And like he told a story once that they were having a marathon race and they wanted him to be the rabbit, you know, the guy that set the pace. And so he started to run, and was leading the pack, and they said, well, run until you get tired. You know, set the pace until you get tired, then just go to the side of the road. And he kept on running and running and running, and he ended up winning the race, and he wasn't even entered in the race, you know. And but I never, well, none of us kind of believed those stories. And yeah, and he was a boxer, and the story was like all these Catholic school parishes and that, not all of them, but a lot of them would have these, they call it lyceum, to keep the kids busy and that stuff. You know, they would go and box, and my dad said you always wanted to be the first guy to box because the tights were clean. You know, everybody wore the same tights. They wore tights in those days, you know, the boxing. He said they were clean, you know, not wet with perspiration and that. And the other story was that he went to Georgetown University on an athletic scholarship, and he was a baseball player, and he was his roommate was a boxer, and you know, they were all gentlemen boxers, you know what I mean, you know, and so he went walking around the campus with this guy, and he said the guy says, I have to go over to you know, work out and with the boxers now. You want to come over and watch us work out? My dad said, sure, I'll go over. You know, it wasn't baseball time for baseball. And he went in, and he had all the boxers, and so he got talking to the coach, and the coach said, are you a boxer? You ever doing boxing? He said, oh yeah, I did some boxing back around home. Well, he had been an amateur champion, you know. And he said, well, you want to box my guy here at your weight? And he said, sure. So he boxed him, and you know, just about destroyed the guy. And he kept on boxing all the way up until he got the heavyweight. You know, he you know, beat every one of them. He beat 4 guys. You know, and so he became the top boxer at Georgetown. And he always said that his job there, you know, they always paid the athletes off. It's a shame, isn't it? They're still doing that, I guess. I don't know. But his job was to teach the prep school, Georgetown Prep, give boxing instructions to all these kids there. He said it was very, very lucrative, very lucrative. But he only lasted a year at Georgetown. You know, he was a boxer and a baseball player.
Now, your mother, Kathleen McNulty,
Kathleen McNulty.
her family was German?
Well, she of course, that name was very Irish, but her I guess someone in the family was very German.
There was some German in her
all
family?
Yeah, and her family were all barrel people. Everything was moved in barrels in those days, and they would recondition and rebuild barrels and sell these barrels at a price. And they had a real nice little business going.
Speaking of that German and the Irish, your mother had a theory about Germans and Irish marrying.
Oh yeah, I think it went beyond her though. But there's an awful lot of Germans in Pittsburgh and a lot of Irish too, and they always felt that my mother did that the combination was a tremendous combination because the Irish had the people skills and the humor and that, and the Germans were very focused and hardworking. And that made for some kids that were could work hard and focus, but really had the touch of the old Nick, the touch of the poet in them.
Now, her family thought that she was marrying down. I understand.
Oh yeah. Oh yes. The Rooneys were bar keepers and and rum runners and whatever you say. And my dad was a few years older than her, and 3 or 4, and they thought that Kathleen Cass, they called her Kass, should have married a lawyer, a doctor, a dentist, or something like that.
I guess they were wrong, huh?
Yeah, I think they were, because he was a good guy. And my mom says that one of his girlfriends, at least the one he would take credit for, was Imogene Coco. Remember the actress? Well, they had a showboat. They had gambling on the boat, and they had some real good entertainment. And he was romancing Imogene Coco, and his job was to walk her dogs. And so when she would get mad, she would say, even in front of us, we didn't know what she was talking about until we got older. She says, if you would have married that Imogene Coco, she said, you would have had 5 dogs rather than 5 cents.
That's pretty good. Now, you also talk a little bit about history in the book, and one of the parts where I don't think a lot of people, certainly young people in Pittsburgh, realize is the great flu epidemic in 1918.
Yeah.
And what were you told about that?
Oh,
That was before you were born.
Yeah,
what
Mom,
were you told about it, and did it affect your family at all?
Yeah, my mom talked about it was like yesterday, and her sisters around, Aunt Mary and Alice McNulty. They would conversations where kids like were spellbound. Mom said that you would walk through the neighborhood. They lived up in Lake Hawk Street near St. Mary's Church, and a step above the ward, a little better neighborhood, according to them. But you would go to visit the dead people. They didn't have the mortuaries and that stuff. And she says, and the next day, you'd be going to visit the other people, and that family all died too. And some of the people that were walking around died. And Dad said that so many people died that they engaged my father, his brother Dan, and brother Jim, the Catholic diocese. We got all these healthy young guys to go out and dig graves. In Calvary or the Pittsburgh North Catholic Cemetery, they were grave diggers. The people, there was no grave diggers because they died too. And it's just a phenomenal thing that everybody was dying, and it was a miracle. I think that, and I really don't have the history on this. I think that one of Dad's sisters might have died during that epidemic. Just a little girl, maybe 4 or 5 years old.
Now, you mentioned that your father went to Georgetown, but he had other scholarship offers.
Oh,
and why don't you talk about that and what his parents thought of those?
Well, he always said that he had a letter from Duke Rockne to go to Notre Dame, and we definitely did not believe that. And when somebody was writing a real thorough biography on Duke Rockne and went and looked through their old files, they found a letter that some correspondence between Duke Rockne had sent to my dad, and we kept on saying, well, gee, man, he wasn't lying about that. And then Penn State was not Joe Paterno and Rip Ingles, Penn State in those days, but they had recruited him, and they wanted to give him a piece of the program, to go up there, and the place he ended up was Indiana Normal was a 2-year school,
which today is
IUP, and he went up there, and but he was really a jock. I mean, he played football and won the boxing championship while he was there. I think he went up to Buffalo and fought the amateur championship and won it, and came back, and the whole school was waiting to meet him, and they had the school band there to meet him, and the way he told the story, that they did not have a train that ran there as a passenger train, but they made arrangements that the train that took the freight and that stuff, that just the engine would come, over from what would be Blairsville. I don't know where the regular train ended, and over to Indiana, and the freight train, just the engine, would bring him over, and they had the band and all that. And a funny little aside there, he had a girlfriend there. Her name was like O'Toole or O'Malley or something, and I remember very, very late in his life, he got a letter. He had won the championships, the Super Bowls, and he had a letter from this gal, and he showed it to us, and she said, two of the biggest thrills of my life was that Art Rooney was my boyfriend while I was a student at IUP, Indiana Normal, and I taught Jimmy Stewart in the first grade. But getting back to it, he also went to Duquesne University. He had gone to Indiana, and it was interesting that he played a day game on Saturday early, late, like 12 o'clock at IUP, and they would play a lot of freshman teams, like Penn State's freshman team, Pitt's freshman team. They had played a West Virginia, I guess, a freshman team, and got beat pretty good. And my dad, got transportation and went back to Duquesne, which was not then Holy Ghost Academy, I guess, and played in another game. Two college games in one day.
How about that?
And whoever were playing, they got killed in that one. That was probably a later afternoon game. But I mean, just the idea that you would play in two colleges at the same day. I don't know. I heard of a lot of guys that like Johnny Blood that would play for Notre Dame and then go and change his name. That's how he got the name Blood. It was McNally. Played for go into Ohio and play for Canton or somebody. The next day, but I never heard of anybody playing for two schools.
Yeah. Now, what did his parents think of him going to college?
Well, the thing about those kids, the boys, the Rooney boys, they all went to college. Love his athletics, but Grandma Rooney, and I don't know what old Pop Rooney, the guy that had the bars, thought, but they got their kids' educations, and of course they were in scholarships and that stuff. But my dad, Dan, Red, which is John. Jim was at Pitt with Jock Sutherland. Vince, he was Duke Rooney. He went, and Tommy was the one that was in the Marines. Got killed during the World War II. He never made it that far, but they were all exposed to college educations. I think my dad never finished college. Grandma Rooney was very much into that, and she wanted him to get a real job. Not be working as going to these different schools and playing ball and that. So she's got him a job with her brother-in-law, Matt Concannon, in one of the steel mills.
I just want to break in there for a second. And this is a great story, and we all have turning points in our life that we make a decision and it affects our lives. And this particular story of your father is a great story about him going to work in the steel mill. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah, and well, like I said, the background was that Grandma got tired of him being what was the word being an itinerant college student, jock. And mine are really just a sandlot baseball player in the summer. Now, remember, you didn't have TV and all those things to entertain the athletes. Athletics were the thing that you did. And so she went, she got him a job with one of the steel mills with her brother-in-law, who was like some type of foreman. Matt Concannon. I always loved that name. Some guy called me the other day and says, I'm Matt Concannon's great-great-great-grandson. Gee, that's really great. There really was a Concannon. You know? and so he went to the steel mill and he worked not even the whole day. He worked until the first shift. The first drink of water or bathroom break. I don't know what it was. And so he's talking to Uncle. He says, Uncle Matt. He says, what do you make here? He said, I don't want to be rude or anything. He said, what do you make? And he says, no, Artie. He said, you're doing real good here today. You keep this up in about 15 years from now, you maybe have a job like this, you know. And he said, well, Uncle Matt, what do you make? And he said, he told him, my dad says, Uncle Matt, he says, I make that much playing semi-pro baseball every summer. He said, I'll see you later. And he walked off, and it was the last job he ever had in his life.
So he didn't even make it the full day.
No, not even the half the day. And he left, and he said, if I ever would go back and try to get my pay from who was J&L or U.S. Steel, he said, they'd owe me an awful lot of interest on that money. He said, he went to it, and he became a semi-pro minor league baseball player, pro boxer for a while. He had about 14 fights, and they were traveling to Australia, fighting their way west with his boxing manager. And the guy they had with him was the champion of Australia, and the that champion boxer's wife got my dad, and she says, Art, the way he told the story, he says, you have education. You have a lot going for you. She said, what do you want to do this for? My husband's a boxer, and when he's through being a boxer, we have nothing, And my dad said they were out and getting close to Chicago. And he went and told the manager that had all these boxers, and he said, hey, this is it. That's my last fight, pro fight. And he had something like 12 pro fights. I don't know how he did. He must have been doing okay at it, but he went back to Pittsburgh, and that may have been when he went to Duquesne University, as a real student. And he said that the one class he took, he's a sort of a wisecracking guy, and the teacher called him aside, and he says, look, he says, you're disrupting this class. He says, and she said, well, I'll put you in your place, and I'll get the class back. He said, what this teacher asked Dad, he said, what are you going to school for? I mean, do you want to be educated, or are you doing it to get a job? Because you want to be educated, fine. He said, but if you're doing it to do a job, you don't have to go to college to get a job. Not a guy like you. He says, you're like a Gandhi dancer. You know what a Gandhi dancer is? No. He said, well, that's a guy on the railroad that goes, whoop. He says, and everybody slams down on the steel spike. He said, you got natural business ability and leadership. He said, if you're going to school to get a job, don't worry about it. So my dad took his advice, and he left school and went, and he was somehow, I don't know, I never really got the straight story. He was a gifted gambler. He had a feel for it, and he knew all the odds. I read a thing once. A sports writer wrote, a racing writer said he knew all the schemes and all the schemers, and he was on top of all of them. He could look at that tote board when you go to a racetrack and just watch it blinking, where the big money was going. He'd give you $5. He said, go bet on $5, $50. He said, go bet on number so and so. He said, I don't even like that horse. He said, but somebody must know something, because an awful lot of money is getting at the end here is getting. So you'd have to run like heck to get to the window and bet for him.
So in 1933, though, your father bought the NFL franchise. How much did he pay for that?
Paid $2,500, and he said if he would give him an argument, they would have given to him free.
No kidding.
See, the thing was that they wanted a team in Pittsburgh, and the reason was Pittsburgh was a rail hub, and everybody could get there. It was easy. It's an overnighter. You could go overnight from Pittsburgh to Chicago, overnight to Pittsburgh to New York, and vice versa. Same with Philadelphia, day trip to Washington and back. Detroit was the same thing. And Cleveland, you had to be a drive, but they did have a team somewhere around that time. And they really, and one of the things that my dad said, you ever notice the number of game officials from Pittsburgh? because Pittsburgh had great football around here. You know, Carnegie, Tech, Pitt, West Virginia, Duquesne, and all the small schools. So we had a lot of guys that were game officials, you know, umpires and things like that. And a lot of them were school teachers, insurance salesmen in Pittsburgh, and they could get them out to the other cities, you know, to go to officiate games. And that was very interesting. My dad told me that. But and the reason they could never have a team in Pittsburgh, they had the blue laws. You were not allowed to play on Sunday. And my dad had gotten to be very big in politics, sort of behind the scenes. And they managed to get that law changed, the blue law changed. It affected the movies and the Pirates, you know, and then there's room for the Steelers then, you know, that you could play. And but they had hours that you weren't on Sunday, you know, that you could play. Would it be like from 1 to 5 or something like that? But you had to have the early morning. You had to have time for church. Later in the evening for families to get together and have their dinner. You know, looking back at it was probably a pretty good idea.
Now, they were not the Steelers right away.
They were the Pirates.
They were the
named
Pirates.
after the baseball team. And finally, when they really got to the point that they had their own identity, then they had to come up with a name, and they had a contest, and I think 10 people won it. And I think of the 10 people that won it, 8 of them they got a bond of some type, savings bond. I think of the 10 people that won the contest, 7 or 8 were relatives and friends of my dad, or some nun. I was down in Palm Beach going to church one day, and the nun came up to me, really an old gal. She says, "I was just a kid." She said, "Just got in the convent." And she said, "I was a school teacher." She says, "I named the Steelers." Well, she was like one of the 7 people, and they had about 10 winners of it. The ticket man, Joe Carr, his wife was one of the winners of the contest. It's sort of an obvious name, the Steelers.
Well, where did they play their games, and where did they get most of their players from in the early days?
They played their games, of course, out at Ford Field, where the Pirates were at, and I think Carnegie Tech played there, and Pitt by that time had moved into Pitt Stadium, and it was a great baseball field, but it was only about 15, stretched 20,000 decent seats there. The rest of them weren't very good seats, but they were only drawing for a real good game. They were drawing 25,000 people. And most of the players, in reality, came from Pitt, West Virginia, Duquesne, I don't know, Carnegie Mellon, Carnegie Tech. They had players, but all the little schools around too, like Westminster.
Now, you talk about your father. Interestingly, he hired his first couple of coaches, but he had fights. I mean, literal fist fights with 2 of his first 3 coaches.
First 2 coaches he duked it out with. No, it was the first 3. Like you said, Louis D'Amelio was an All-American at Pitt, played with his brother Jim under Sutherland. And he came over and coached the second team, and they had a discussion that became an argument in his office at the old Fort Pitt Hotel of who was, a good boxer could beat any, football player, baseball player. And Luby said, no, he had been an All-American at Pitt. He said, good condition that a football player can beat anybody. So my dad sent out to get a pair of boxing gloves. And the way the story went, and they moved all the furniture back. He and Luby were going to duke it out. And our equipment guy, was in charge of the gloves. Equipment that he said, what do you want? You want the gloves that the kids spar around with, great big cushions, or do you want the ones they box with, the fights and that, the pro fights? And my dad said, get the regular boxing clubs that you fight the pro fights. So he got over there, and Luby was a big, strong guy, and a real good player and a tough guy. But my dad had been an amateur champion, a fought pro boxer, and they moved his furniture back, and he just tore him to ribbons, blood, and beat the heck out of him. Well, poor Luby, the thing that happened, he lost all credibility with the players. The owners just beat the hell out of him, And so then they brought Joe Bach in, Joe was an interesting guy. He had been a real top wrestler, at he went to Notre Dame, but before Notre Dame, he was another place, in another college. They did those things in those days. And, 4 years didn't mean that much. You could play 5 or 6, And he had been a top wrestler. And so my dad and Joe got into an argument on a train about some scheduling thing and that. And they got into it. And, there was no pushover. They said they were on the floor. Joe had my dad in some type of hold, and my dad was pining away at him, and Father Silas, Uncle Dan, when I was a priest, had to come in and break. He let them fight for a while. He had to break it up.
Now, talking about boxing, my grandfather used to tell me about the Pittsburgh Kid, and you say in the book that your father was close with the Pittsburgh Kid.
Well, Billy Kahn, my father was not, my dad's partner, Milt Jaffe, was his business manager, Kahn's. And my father was kind of, he knew boxing, and they had this boxing club. They put fights on that. And he was an unofficial, and everybody will tell you this, he was an unofficial handler, whatever term you want to put, what would you call him? But he had a lot to do with him. I guess a guy named Jacobs was the main, boxing, impresario, whatever it would be in New York, and they were fooling around with Kahn how they're going to schedule. And my dad went and told him, he says, "Hey, listen, you're not going to get away with that." He said, "You're not dealing with some of these guys you have around here." He said, we'll just take Kahn right out of here. And if you ever saw the movie The Cinderella Man about Jimmy Braddock, became a world champion, they had great scenes in that movie about how they just used these boxers. When I saw that movie, what they did to Braddock, during the Depression, just begging for a fight, and he was working on a dock, and just couldn't get a fight. I just appreciate it more my dad had done for Billy Kahn. He loved Kahn, and
fought Joe Louis.
Well, he almost beat Joe Louis, and he was a cocky little guy, and light. He was tall, but he was not a heavy guy. And I think Timmy Kahn, Billy Kahn's son, told me that he probably only weighed 160 pounds when he fought Louis, but he was so quick and he almost beat him. And years later, Kahn became a great friend of Joe Louis, and he said, "Joe, if I could just have beat you, I know I couldn't beat you all the time." He said, "But I just beat you. He said, I could at least been the champion for 6-8 months." And Louis said to him, he said, "Billy," he said, "you couldn't even beat your father-in-law," because he said, "How are you going to beat me?" Because after that fight with Joe Louis, he almost won. He went home and had a fight with his father-in-law. And the father-in-law, Jimmy Smith, got a lot of good punches on Kahn. My dad was at that. It was a christening, I think, for Timmy Kahn. And my dad was his godfather, and they said there was blood spattered all over the place. Billy's blood. Jimmy Smith. Jimmy Smith was a tough guy. He was a big league baseball player. But I thought that was one of the funniest things I ever heard when Joe Louis told me, he said, "Heck, you couldn't even beat your father-in-law. How are you going to beat me?"
Now, Pittsburgh has, I guess, a certain kind of language called Pittsburghese, Dantanyins, and that. But you talk about in the book Rooney speak and some of the Rooney sayings, some of the things that your father used to say that you grew up with. And can you give a couple examples of that?
Yeah, the one that gets me all the time, because he used to hurt our feelings all the time, he called us brand new. You're not a bunch of rich kids. You're brand new. You never did a darn thing. You're unwrapped. You're still on the shelf. You never had to go out and hustle to make a buck. And he called my brothers a sap. And he said they call him a sap all the time, so much they went and looked it up in the dictionary. And he said a sap, they said the dictionary says sap is somebody that's not capable of doing anything but digging a ditch. And that's how they came up with that thing, the chief. He was always calling us these names and all these little, like I say, Rooney speak type of stuff. and so they came up with their own. The TV had finally come in, and one of the shows that the kids always watched was Superman. And the guy that Superman, Clark Kent, the reporter, worked for was Perry White was the editor of the newspaper, and they called him the chief. So the kids started calling him the chief. And it took some years, but we all called him the chief behind his back again. Mm-hmm. And finally, like some of the secretaries picked it up, at the Stewart office, and then the players picked it up, and then the newspaper guys. But no one ever called him the chief. The newspaper guys and people didn't know him, but the secretaries never. I had a real good secretary, and when she first met the chief, she referred to him as the chief, and everybody looked at her, and then when my father walked away, the other girl says, "Oh, no one here ever calls Mr. Rooney the chief," and that's, just behind his back, or the press call him that.
Now, my mother-in-law is not a big sports fan, but she's a devout Catholic, and she doesn't know much about sports, but she told me something about your family the other day, which surprised me that she knew, and what she said was that your family always said the rosary at dinner?
Right after dinner, excuse me, we would say the family rosary. And the family had prayed together, stayed together. And boy, and he was a sticker on that. And we would get in the living room there, and I remember yell for the other kids, "Rosary!" And so they'd all come in, and then the neighborhood kids would come in, and I remember a couple of times the kid would just come in there and sit there, and "You're not a Catholic." My dad would say to the other one, "You're not a Catholic." My dad said, "Let him hear. Just sit there and be quiet." So we'd say the rosary, and each of us get a chance to lead a decade of the rosary, and then when he would go away, Dan was in charge of the rosary, and if Dan wasn't there, I was in charge of the rosary. When I wasn't there, Tim would be. There were three of them. They still said it. And I remember one time, we were 5 boys, and we're teenagers, and we were saying the rosary, and I thought Tim got sacrilegious. He wasn't saying it right. And I said, "You're not saying the rosary right." And it ended up in a fight. And boy, it was a big fist fight between Tim and I. And he finally picked a lamp up and hit me with the lamp. And I was blood all over myself. And the doorbell rang. It was Father Silas, Uncle Dan. And he came in and he says, "What are you guys doing?" And we says, "We're saying the rosary." And here I'm blood all over me. And he says, "Yeah, you're saying the rosary. What are you doing?" But I don't know. It sort of gave us some, direction in life. I'll say that.
Well, as I read the book, it just seemed like religion was important to your father, and it was important for him to talk to you kids about it. And how did that affect you? And what was it like in the Rooney family from a spiritual standpoint?
You all went to Catholic schools. You all knew right and wrong. You couldn't, you had those values of the Catholic schools. You had the nuns and the brothers and the priests, at St. Vincent and Duquesne and Mount St. Mary's. My father told us something toward the end of his life, because I think he thought that people felt that he became religious when he knew he was going to die. And he says, I went to church all the time. He says, when I was a kid at St. Peter's, he said, we lived down the ward. He says, my mother got terribly sick. He says, I was only 16 years old. He was the oldest one in the family. He says, and she was down there in a fever and that stuff. And he said the church opened up at 7 in the morning. It closed at 7 at night. He says, and I got 7 in the morning. And he says, and I didn't leave. I didn't eat. I just prayed, for the whole 7 to 7. And I was very impressed with that. And then I thought to myself, what were the bathrooms at St. Peter's Church? They did have them, but I didn't know. But the idea with that was to show that he wasn't the guy, although he was a tough guy, who just found religion. he would find a church. I mean, that guy, he wasn't just a guy that went to church at home where you rolled out of bed and went to church. I kind of do that. We have so many churches around. I go before I come to. I was at church this morning. All the five boys do that, but he would find a church on the road, and boy, what a pain that could be. Especially if you got out to his farm in Maryland. Maybe 30 miles away. Well, that was like 60 miles over country roads to get to a church and back. And he had a driver once was a tough guy. He carried money with him. He had to have a sort of a tough guy with him. And the guy was some type of a minor thief. They stayed at a bed and breakfast, they call them nowadays. And I think this guy's name was like Cocky O'Malley. They call him Cocky because he was so cross-eyed. And he was a tough guy, a slugger and that. And no guns, never any pistols or anything like that. And they left the bed and breakfast. My father had gone to church when he got back. They had breakfast, and so they just left, and they got down the road, and my dad looked in the back seat, and here was all the pillows and blankets this guy had swiped from the bed and breakfast. They were about 15 miles down the road. He says, "What is this?" He says, "Well, they just had that stuff laying around." He says, "Laying around?" He said, "That was people's blankets and that stuff." He made the guy turn around, and they drove 15 miles. So that was 15 miles out, 15 miles back, and 15 more down the road.
That's a great story.
And well, that's only one of them. They went up to Cleveland. He was meeting with about a preseason game in Cleveland, and I think it was the same guy. He had to drive him, and he got back to his hotel room after meeting with, like, the mayor was at the time, at this meeting, and they got back to the hotel, and my dad, there's tires and a battery and that stuff, and he says, "Well, where in the world is all this stuff?" He says, "Well," he said, "I would stop at the gas station, and they weren't open yet." He said, "They had all this stuff sitting around." He said, "I just took it. They're not serious about it. They would have had it sitting out." And he said, "We have to take that back." And so somehow they worked out a way to take this stuff back without this guy getting caught, and but he was very, very, very honest, but he came from that tough neighborhood, and he had tough guys around him. They never, nor his brothers, they were tough guys with tough people. Never mistake kindness for weakness. Treat everybody the way you want it to be treated, but never allow anyone to mistake kindness for weakness. But they never never crossed the line to become criminals.
Do you think that was because of religion?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that was because of the religion, and I think in addition to that, they had something with sports, and I definitely think that.
Now, you also say your father taught you religion, morals, and character. How so?
Well, I think the character part, in addition to the education and how we were acted at home, is the example he gave. He was, like I say, a tough guy in a tough world. But there's tough guys and there are bad guys. And, he would distinguish between them. I don't want that guy around here. I don't want you, even when we got older, I don't want you to associate with that guy. He's a bad guy. This guy over here is a tough guy, a slugger. Well, he's all right. But the morals is what he and Mom, the way they acted. And I know there was a thing in the book, a little thing in the book that he told, again, very, very old, that Mom had a babysitter. And my dad traveled a lot, and my mother really liked this babysitter. It was a nice-looking gal, and was real good with the kids. And my dad said, "Kathleen, fire the babysitter." And she says, "Well, that gal's a real good girl. She really is great with the kids." He said, "Fire the babysitter." And so a couple of days later, he'd gone on a trip and came back, and he said, "Hey, I told you to fire that babysitter." He says, "I'm not going to fire her." He says, "Look," he says, "what do you have to have? A ton of bricks fall on you?" He said, "Fire the babysitter. She wants to go to bed with me The only one I want to go to bed with is you. And the way he told the story, it wasn't 5 minutes, the babysitter out.
That's all your mother needed to hear.
Yeah, all she needed to hear. But I mean, you were asking about morals, and that was it. You know, they had sexual morals, and I never heard him tell a dirty joke. I never heard him laugh at that type of stuff. I never really heard him swear. Now, on the other hand, Mom was a gal, and her sister lived with her, Aunt Alice McNulty, would actually truthfully pray the pages out of their prayer books. Go to Mass every morning. You know, all these novenas they would have would go all over Pittsburgh. You know, they had these novenas where it's just like 4 days of prayers and things like that. And Mom and Aunt Alice could swear like troopers. You know, they got mad. You got something got online, they'd let you know about it. My dad never. He would. It's a crink in his armor. He would never swear.
Well, speaking of your mother, what was her influence on you and the children and the family?
Well, in the book, and I didn't write it to be poetic or anything like that. It's just the way I felt. That when Mom died, I lost my mother. My dad was Art Rooney, but Mom was Mom. And she had a sense of humor. She was witty, well-read. You call a spade a spade. It was extremely nice to all the poor kids in the neighborhood. I remember when one of our neighborhood kids played for the Steelers and played for Buffalo and Washington. And he was a real good coach. He died while he was up in Denver. He was about 30, older than that. He must have been about 45 years old, maybe a little bit older. He called me on the phone. He called Dan, too, and I don't know what he said to Dan, but I know he called me, and he said, I'm not going to make it. And they were giving him chemo and that stuff. He just said, hey, I'm going to die. Let me die, you know. He said, I just wanted to tell you how much I loved your mother. And, I mean, that was so important to us. You know.
I understand. You know, it's funny you say that and how you say that, because I read somewhere the other day where a kid could live in the worst place in the world, but the one chance that they would have is if they had a strong and a loving mother.
Yeah. Tom Murray, my dad's old friend, who was a very, very well-educated guy, was a successful banker, and he was a Georgetown guy, and he told me one time, he said, the mothers are so important. He says, you know, show me a good mother and a horrible, nurturing mother in a horrible situation. The kids have a chance. He says, very low chance if the father is really good, but if they have a mother, they have a chance. You know, the mother is so important.
Absolutely. Now, growing up as kids in the north side, you and your brothers, what kept you guys out of trouble, and what was it like growing up?
Well, we grew up on the north side. My dad, he used to call it putting on the dog. You're trying to act like you're big shots, and that was a thing with him. And we lived in an old mansion over in Lincoln Avenue, Ridge Avenue. It was Millionaires Row, and they had these beautiful, beautiful houses, and they were all just decaying and falling apart, and they became rooming houses during the Second World War. And a lot of country people, mountain people in West Virginia and places like that. But it was a real, truthfully tough neighborhood. We had a kid that got sent to jail for murder, and it was a pretty nice kid too. And other guys, were robbery guys, counterfeiters. One kid was a priest, a cousin, and but very few of these kids made it out of there, without being scathed. And but mom insisted on us going to Ligonier, PA every summer. The day school was out, we left and we came back the day after Memorial Day start. then we had the football teams we were on, and tutors and all that sort of stuff. And that was a pretty tough environment. And um, yeah, but like my dad, we had sports. I remember that Dad he put on the boxing matches. We were allowed to take all our friends. Baldy Riggin was a friend of ours. He was a politician at the time, and he was one of the guys we knew from North Catholic. But he said there's always room. The only reason you could not go with the Rooneys to a game or a boxing match is because they ran out of room in a car. Because we always went to these places. The hockey games. Before that was real popular. My dad knew John Harris, who had the hockey team, and we used to go out to watch as many games as we could. And when they were at home, and after the games, you would go ice skating on old Duquesne Gardens. They had about 15 minutes of ice skating. And Harris's son, went to school with us up at Mount Mercy Academy, and so we could stay longer. While they had their big Zamboni machines out and that. And we go with him in the states that allowed it. You go to the racetrack with them, but always to the farms and watch the new horses and that. And we were just really into being exposed. We grew up with it, the sports. And I think that was part of the thing that kept us out of trouble.
Now you talk about your father's brothers.
Yeah.
And can you just mention something briefly about each one of them?
Well, Father Silas, was kind of the jewel of our family. An Irish Catholic family. That a guy became a priest. He was just a special guy, and he was a minor league baseball player and a real good one. And he went up to St. Bonaventures when he decided he wanted to be a priest and became a Franciscan. He was a missionary in China, and he was a chaplain during World War II in some big battles, and came back and had various jobs. And was the athletic director of St. Bonnie's. He was, worked in New York, worked in Boston, and places like that. And he was a tremendously interesting guy, but was a very, very private, guy. He was not an interesting thing about him. He was not the storyteller that my dad and Uncle Jim and the other ones were. They were great storytellers. My dad could never tell a joke, but he could really tell good stories. He always missed the punchline. But Father Dan was just a phenomenal guy who.
But he was the guy that you were just talking about. Don't confuse kindness with weakness, because he was a tough guy, real tough guy. But he was also a wonderful father in terms of his religion and the things that he did with his life.
Oh, he when Dad told a story on the north side, they would have crap games, dice games. And they would throw a blanket down, and then they'd play craps on the blanket. And if the dice, somehow one of the dice is a die, I don't know the proper word, went off, well, the toughest guy there would call, if it was still in play or not in play. And Dan had got hurt playing ball, and he came to this crap game and on crutches. And you were a guy from another neighborhood. He wasn't only tough, he was a bad guy. There's a distinction between being a tough guy and being a bad guy. And he was a bad tough guy, And he had taken over the crap game, and he was calling it if it was in play, the dice were in play or not. And he was calling them all for himself. And so Dan looked and he said, "Hey, you're cheating everybody here." And the guy said, "Well, what are you going to do about it? You can't do anything about it. You have those crutches." He said, "Well, I'll show you how to do with the crutches." And he took the crutch and beat the hell out of the guy with his crutch and ran him down the street. They went up. Dad and Dan was a catcher. My dad was a shortstop or a second baseman. And they played for the Wheeling Stogies. That's the picture that's on the front of the book. And they were playing a exhibition game against Cumberland, I guess it was, up in Frostburg, Maryland. And in those days, of course, there's no microphones. They use a megaphone. You yell through it. Up at bat, Rooney, up at bat, Rooney again, up at bat, McGraw, up at bat, and some Italian name. And those were the days when the Ku Klux Klan was still around, and they're very anti-Catholic, and of course knew about what they thought of the blacks, and so every time they would call out the batting order and give the Irish name, they figured they were all Catholics. I'm sure there's a lot of Irish guys that aren't, but they figured they were all Catholics. They would get these horrible boos and things like that. And so the players on the other team picked it up too, calling them mackerel snappers and all that kind of stuff. And so a fight broke out, and it was a vicious fight. And the leaders of the fight were the Rooney boys. And it was a double header. So in between the two games, the Wheeling team went to a little sandwich shop, to get some sandwiches, get ready for the second game. And then comes the Cumberland players, the same guys they had just fought. And the fight broke out again, and they wrecked this little sandwich shop. And so the town fathers came to the guy that managed and owned the Wheeling team, and he says, he said, we really love baseball, and we like having you guys around here. He said, but never, ever again are the Rooney boys ever allowed in Frostburg, Maryland. Well, the reason I'm laughing is that years and years later, Dad's two of his grandkids were playing football for W&J, Washington Jefferson College, and they called my dad and they says, grandfather, they says, we're playing up at what W&J is playing up at Frostburg State College, and we'd really like you to come up and see it because it's an easy ride now. They have a big highway up there. He said, "Oh, boys, I'd love to go there." He said, "But he says your Uncle Dan, who they knew his father Dan, and I are barred from that town forever." And even later on than that, the Steelers played the Redskins in a scrimmage up there, and I couldn't help it. I had to call a few of the newspaper guys. I said, I guess the football team's not barred, but the Rooney boys are barred from Frostburg.
Your Uncle Jim, he was a great football player.
He was a real good player.
Played for Jock Sutherland.
He played for Jock Sutherland. He was truly a great punter. Gee, nowadays he could get a 10-year career out of that in the NFL. And he was a good, strong runner, and made some big plays for them. Played on the Rose Bowl team, but he got hurt in an automobile accident, driving to New York, and up in Bedford, and he was a cripple forever after. And it's a shame because the Steelers started like 2 years later, I guess, in 1933. That was like 1931, and he really could have played for the Steelers and really been a punter and but as well as being a player. But he coached the Steelers for a couple of years. But he really he was with Arthur. His life was with Arthur. Now, being with Arthur could have meant a number of things. He could have been my dad's top advisor. He could be the guy that got things done for Arthur, his money man, whatever it was. Well, Jim was none of them, but he realized all he had to say, I'm with Arthur. Jim was an alcoholic. My dad kept, and they loved Jim, and they all loved him, but he was very unreliable. But he had tremendous sarcasm, irony, remarkable type of guy, and a good-looking guy, and big guy.
You had a great story about him with Guy Lombardo. We were still at the Roosevelt Hotel, and Jim, at that time, Grandma had died, and he was living at the Roosevelt, and it was lunchtime, and they had the Curbstone coaches. They'd have a little gathering on like Monday morning quarterback type thing, and they called it the Curbstone coaches. And Jim, like the Steelers had played, Carnegie Tech had played, Pitt had played, the top high school played, and Duquesne wasn't playing at that time. But they'd have the coach from the team come in and give a little talk, and they'd ask questions. And Guy Lombardo was a great friend of a guy named Alex DeGrosse, who was the head food and beverage guy at the Roosevelt Hotel, and so he came over to have lunch with us. He was a football nut, and the nicest guy. You used to see him on New Year's all the time on TV, but he was a
real nice, comfortable guy to be with, and you know, that asked all the right questions and never acted like a big shot and that stuff. And he was with a group of people who didn't know a trombone from a violin, and he didn't care. He just wanted to be around the football guys. But Uncle Jim came into the Curbs on Coaches, and he had a buzz on. He was starting to travel, to complete annihilation, So, anyways, he mistook Guy Lombardo for Vince Lombardi, and he said, "Coach, I'm surprised." Lombardo. He says, "Coach," he says, "I'm surprised that you're here. I thought you'd be with the team." And he says, "Well, it's Monday, and you probably have some business here in time." And so, as the luncheon went on, he'd keep on talking to Lombardo like he was Lombardi, and said, "Man," he said, that Horning, I really like him. Yeah, he said, he's really, as a guy that I didn't know would be a great pro like this." And he says, "I think Jimmy Taylor really is a guy that does it, that blocks for him and that stuff." And they had this conversation, and Lombardo kept on trying to tell him, "No, it's not me," and Jim wouldn't listen to him. And finally, everybody at the table was just like screaming and laughing, and the other people at this, luncheon thought that, we were laughing at the things that were said, and some of it was inappropriate, but it was, Jim kept on coming back to the Packers, and finally he got up. Jim stood up and he said, "Coach Lombardi," he said, I think you have a chance to win the championship this year, and my very, very best of luck to you." And he limps out of the place, staggering because he can't walk anyways, and he's half loaded. And Lombardo said, "Gee, that was one of the most enjoyable lunches I've ever had."
I think I would have paid admission to sit at that table.
Oh yeah, it went. Like I say, everybody there, and we had a big group there. Everybody from the steward office, were just screaming and laughing. Our former trainer, Ralph Berlin, told me the other day, he was over visiting, and he said, "My first job was the Steelers, because we were at Roosevelt Hotel." He said, "Was to go over and fetch Uncle Jim out of Frenchie's Bar and Grill." He's across the street, and he said, our business manager was a guy named Fogarty, and Fogarty says, "Hey, Berlin," he says, "go over and get Jim, and bring him over and put him in his room in the hotel." He said, "Went over," and he says, and Jim was out of money, and he said, Berlin introduced himself. He says, "Good to meet you, Ralph." He says, "Buy me a drink, will you?" He said he bummed a drink off, and he said they took him back over and got in the hotel.
That's funny. Now, you talk the early days. You talk about the early days of the Steelers in the book, and the early decades actually, and they really struggled for a long, long time. And I'm not sure the younger people in this day and age really realize that. But you really talk about the history of how they struggled.
Well, in Pittsburgh, the hierarchy was boxing. We had something like 6 champions. Harry Greb and Fritzie Zivik and Billy Kahn, and we had a tremendous number of great fighters here. And that was like the number one thing. And then you had the Pirates were real good, the Pie Trainer and the Weiner brothers and Hans Wagner before that. And then the University of Pittsburgh with Jock Sutherland. In 1933, it was a depression when Dad came in and got this franchise. There was a ton of football players. My dad always said that his semi-pro teams, the Hope Harveys, could have beat some of the NFL teams, and they did. The first year they won 2 games and tied 1, and the next year they won 1 and 1. But I mean, he sort of is vindicated in what he was saying, because these guys could win. They just weren't that organized. But the Pirates, early Steelers, they were, that was an afterthought. They would, I guess they would draw when the Chicago Bears and Bronco Nagurski came to town, or the Eagles. It was a cross-state thing, and then sometimes the Giants. But and you got to make your money on those games. They went in the preseason. He went up to Dad took the team up to Rock Island, Rhode Island, once to play George Halas's Bears, and they took the bus up there, and they had to push the bus over the hills, and that's the truth. I mean, you always hear those stories, and the players had to get up and out and push the bus over the big hills. You know, the hills in the Ohio area, but you know, the mountain type areas. You know, going to New York and Washington, and they got up there and played in Rock Island, and the weather got bad, and they didn't have very many people. And after the game, Hallis was paying the chief, and I think he was getting like $200 for the trip. And my dad said, "Well, you promised me $500, you know, just for making this, you know, moving the game from here, you know, Chicago here and that stuff." And he said, "I never promised that." You know, Coach Hallis said that. My dad said, "You did so, George. You told me you'd give me $500." And so finally they had a big argument, and George said, "I'll fight you for the $500." So now he's fought with two of his first three coaches. Now he's got to fight with one of the other owners for $500. He said, "George, I don't want to fight you for it. Come on, you gave me your word. You know you give me the $500." You know. So he gave me the $500. My dad walked over to the door, and it was always like that Columbo guy that used to be on, you know, the old detective. He got to the door, opened the door, and turned around and says, "Hey, George," he says, "don't be so sure you're going to win that fight." You know, because that's one thing the chief knew how to do it. He knew how to fight.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, had some good players back in the days, and some of them got away. I think one that really stands out to me was Johnny Unitas.
Yeah, well, of course, you know, Unitas got to Pittsburgh, and you know, he's from Louisville, and he was like the 12th or 13th pick. I don't know, you know, late like that. Maybe it was the 9th pick. I don't know, and he really was a strong arm guy. He was a Pittsburgh guy, and my dad loved that, you know, and went to St. Justin's High School, and my dad loved that too, and you know, a good Ukrainian kid and all that, and he never got a chance. You know, they had Jimmy Finks, who was a good football player, Teddy Marshall-Broda, who became a real good coach, but he was sort of a short guy for a football player. And a kid, I think his name is Vic Eaton from Missouri, who was like a two-way player and a punter. Well, you know, you save money on that, you know, two-way player and a punter. And every time it got to be Unitas' time to do a drill, the coaches would look at their clock and their watch and blow the whistle. You know, he never got a chance to do anything. And he was the guy that stayed after practice and got all the ball boys and the equipment guys and told them just run, and he'd bounce the ball off their heads, you know. And so my brother Tim wrote, all the kids knew how great his arm was and that stuff, and a lot of the players did too. And Tim wrote my dad an 11-page letter, although it's 22 pages, you know, because on each side, how great of a player Unitas was going to be and how stupid the coaches were because they're going to, you know, fire him. And that's the way it worked out too, you know. But you don't know, he was the guy that became a Hall of Famer, one of the great players. You don't know, you know, some of the guys that just went home, you know, right. Didn't get a chance.
Well, your brother Tim was vindicated there.
Big time. And you know, it's funny. You know, my dad was going to a funeral. He's a great guy to go to funerals, and it's been before the days of air conditioning, of course. And he was driving to this funeral and going down, I guess, Liberty Avenue, West Liberty Avenue, and or up West Liberty Avenue. That would have been it from the north side, through the tunnels, you know, the Liberty tubes. And all Kiesling, the coach, had cut, you know, this was in the car, and my dad and my brother John was driving, and John stopped at a traffic light, and he started to talk to the guy in the next car. Like I said, the windows were down, you know, there's no air conditioning. And he said, my dad said, "Who is that kid you're talking to?" And he said, "Oh, that's Johnny Unitas, was with us last year." My dad said, "Catch up to him." So the next light, he caught up to him, and my dad, you know, yelled out the window to him. He says, "Hey, Unitas, you know who I am." He said, "Oh, hi, Mr. Rooney. Yeah, how you doing?" He said, "Fine." He says, "Look, I hope you become the greatest football player that ever lived." And and then the lights changed, and they, you know, and Kiesling sitting in the back seat. My father turned back and just looked at Kies and gave him a dirty look, you know. And but that made Unitas' book. And my brother John, you know, that was his main claim to fame. He made, well, that was his story, you know. Actually, in Unitas' book, I was a driver, and I wasn't, you know. But okay, but
Details.
yeah, detail. But my brother Dan, we were at a board meeting. You know, my dad was gone. It was the last few years. You know, and, we're at a Steeler board meeting, family meeting, and Dan told the same story. Only he was the driver. My brother Dan. And now they're getting this big fight at the board meeting. It's not about football, not about anything important. It's who drove the darn car. And John says, "Well, I drove that car." And he said, "You put in that story that you had that you drove the car." And Dan said, "Well, I did drive the car." He says, "You're crazy." And he says, "There's only 3 of us in the car, and you weren't there." And Dan says, "You know, you just don't remember. You just can't. It's too long ago." And they're having this big argument who drove the car. And finally, John says, "You know, you're a big shot." He says, "You know, you're in the Hall of Fame." He said, "I have nothing. The only thing I had, I drove that car." and so they're going at it. They're not laughing either. And I said, "Well, wait a minute. I'll sell this whole thing." I said, "I don't know who drove that car. John, you always told the story before Dan did, but I don't know." I said, "But Unitas said in that book that I drove the car. And I know I didn't." I said, "But I'm going to sell this argument. I was the guy that drove that car." Yeah.
Now, from the 30s through the 60s, why don't you mention some of the players of the Steelers that really stand out to you and that were standout players?
Well, we had Whizzer White, who became a United States Supreme Court Justice, and he was a real good player, too. He was a leading ground gainer with us. Then he went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship and came back and did the same thing with the Detroit Lions. So if a guy does it twice, that's not luck, and of course we had Lynn Chadnoys, who could have been a great player, but he was a good player with us. And Albie Nickel was a great player. He was a tight end, and he caught so many passes. He played like close to 200 games without ever missing a game. And I always thought that every pass that Albie caught should have counted as 2 because of the terrible beatings he took. Then Jack Butler was truly a great player. Neither Albie or Jack are in the Hall of Fame, but they should at least be nominated for it. And it's too late for Albie to enjoy it because he's passed away a couple years ago. But Jack's still with us and still vibrant, and it'd just be real nice for him. And Jack always says that, he said, "That's not important to me. It'd be important to my family." He said, "The important thing to me is I played." Jack has a bad knee, and he says, if I had a chance to play again, in spite of everything, he said, I'd play. He said, I'd play till they carry me off the field again.
Well, you
they
said
were warriors. They were warriors.
Well, you said he was one of the 2 best free agent signings that the Steelers.
Yeah, there's no doubt. He was up at St. Bonaventures and had been in the seminary. He never played high school football, and he was in the seminary. And my uncle, Father Dan, saw him and said, "Jack," he said, "your dad played semi-pro football with my brother Art and myself." And he said, "And he was a real good player. If you have any of his bloodlines, you should be a good football player." So Jack went out for the team and became a real top team. And Father Dan called, got him to try it with the Steelers. And Jack was actually the last cut. And the reason he made the team is that he was the sole support of his mother, and it was during the Korea War. And they were not drafting kids, for the Army who had been, were the sole support of their parent. And so he missed the, he made the team, and ended up being I think a 4-time Pro Bowler, All-Pro about 3 times. At the time was the second leading interceptor, and really is a guy who should be in the Hall of Fame, but it's never even been nominated. It's like Andy Russell, made 7 Pro Bowls, never nominated.
Now, also a guy that the Steelers retired his jersey was Ernie Stautner.
Yeah, he was a Superman. The 17-year-old, he's in the battle for Okinawa, in the Marine, and he was not a real tall guy. He was about 6'1". Probably in those days, weighed about 225, but he was a strong, played with great leverage and was mean and tough and smart for a lineman. And he was truly, in that era, was an Ironman and a dominant football player. I remember one time that he was injured, and the doctor had some painkiller with him, and the nurse had put a knockout type of drug in the doctor's bag rather than the painkiller. And at halftime, he was injured, but you got to know the difference between hurt and injury. He was hurt, but not a serious injury, but enough that he should have got a shot or whatever they gave him in those days. And they did things in those days they don't do now, or at least it's not legal now. And here it was like sodium pentothal or something. He got this shot of this stuff, and it would have killed anybody. But they called him the horse, you know what I mean? And it killed anybody else, but he was just going in and out of consciousness. So they sent for a priest, and the priest came in, and Ernie says, "Father, come here." He says, I don't know I have time. Something's wrong with me." He says, "So listen, and listen good, because I only have time for the highlights. You don't have time for a whole confession. So I only have time for the highlights." With him and his pal Bobby Lane, they must have had some real highlights too.
That's funny. Now, you say back in those days, back in the 30s, 40s, that the NFL practiced de facto segregation. What did you mean by that?
Well, the first team my dad was on, he had a guy named Kemp, and that was a player at Duquesne University, played on his Hope Harvey teams and that, and he played for the Steelers, and after that he never played again in the major leagues, in the NFL, and it went another 13 years. Be 10, more than that, until after this World War II, that the black players started to get a chance to play. It was really just tragic, because I started to go to the black schools. I would think, gee, man, these are great athletes that didn't play, and they're really nice guys too. You get to know these players at these black schools and that stuff, and the coaches and that stuff, and just really decent guys, they from 1934 on, the Steelers never had a player until 1952, I guess it was.
Well, a lot of old timers, I guess, had racist attitudes, but your father, he didn't seem to be that way.
My dad was always a very fair type of guy, and I remember he told us one time, he said, we can get a real top black. He said, your mom and I would move out of our bedroom, and he could have our bedroom. And I'll tell you a story, though, that happened about that time. We brought in a guy named Jack Spinks, who ended up playing as a starter on the Giant championship team. And my Uncle Jim was was up at camp. They always had a place for Jim to be, and so the coaches were having a meeting, and they were making their cuts, They got to Spinks, and they said, "Well, this guy has great potential, but and he can." He said, "We just don't have time to work with him." He said, "He just doesn't even have a sport coat. He doesn't have a coat. You have to dress up to go in these hotels and that, and the ones that they could get in, and the blacks could get in." And my Uncle Jim went and got a sport coat and threw it on the table, and he said, "Well, he has a coat now." But they did have an idea of fairness, and I don't know if they were trying to break a racial barrier, but it's a fairness. The guy was a good guy. Spinks in a scrimmage got tackled by a real nice guy, from the South, and Spinks hit him so hard. He was a fullback, and he caught a swing pass, and went out, and this kid came up, and he was a brave guy. He hit this guy. It was like a train, the Spinks, and he took the brunt of it, the defensive back. And he jumped up at the ball, and he got the ball somehow off of Spinks, and he hit him in the face with it. But they had the helmet on; it didn't really make a difference. And Spinks just stood there, And so my father got Spinks a little later, and he said, "I heard you had some problem practice yesterday." And he said, "Oh, no, I didn't have any practice." And he says, "I heard about it." He says, "Look," he said, that kid that went after you like that. He says, he's really a nice kid. He said, just, where he's from, where you're from. And he said, but I'll tell you something, Jack. He said, the next time anything like ever happens, you just kick the stuffings out of him. And even though he liked the kid, the Southern kid, and I know who the kid was, and I won't use his name, he's passed away. He said, you just beat the hell out of him. Although my dad was never one to use like hell and damn, but you just beat him up.
Now, Jackie Robinson was he's the real poster child, I guess, for breaking the color barrier in the national in the major leagues baseball. But who were the pioneers in football and for the NFL, but that's also for the Steelers?
Well, like I say, we had Kemp played for us early. The Fritz, what was his name? Just got in the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago. A black guy, Pollard. But they just, you only had 28 guys on the team. They used to go to our bench and count the guys and make sure we had like 18 guys. My dad used to go to his father's brewery and get some of the big fat guys and put a uniform on them. So we had the right number of guys to play. So they were not about the. I'm saying this in fairness to them. There's very little fairness. What happened with the blacks, but in fairness, a little bit of fairness to them. They then. They're supposed to have 18 guys. Say they never even had 18. They went out and dressed some of the big fat guys, around the brewery, make sure they play with 11 guys, 12 guys, But after World War II, the Rams went at the Coliseum. The Rams had moved from the Cleveland Rams out to become the Los Angeles Rams, and they wanted to play in the Coliseum. And the only way that they could get the contract was to get a couple black players. And one of the guys was Willie Strode, who became a real good cowboy actor. And the other one was, what was his name? It was something like Robinson, but it was not, he had been a great player, this other fellow, a real classy guy out at UCLA or USC. But the All-American Conference started. And Paul Brown had been the head coach at Ohio State, knew all the personnel in Ohio State, the Big Ten, and had coached the Great Lakes football team. They had some of these black players. And he brought in some great black players like, Motley, Willis, the defensive nose guard, and then George House had Willie Gallimore, and so they started to come in, and all they needed was a chance. I used to go to those black schools, and the coaches would tell me, just give us a chance. All we need is a chance. And boy, were they right. We went having maybe 4 or 5 on the team, and 35 years later, 60, sometimes 70% of the players are black.
Yeah, how ironic
and
is
you
that?
got the head coach, is black.
Right.
And, one of the things I had to do in this book is, and I worked on it, Roy McCune, I worked on it. I had some real stories about the evolution of that with the N-word that I had to cut out, but it was really showed how you went from calling the guys that all the way up to the point where you had 30%, 70%, and then you had a black head coach. But it just wasn't politically correct. I put it in there.
So you had to sanitize it.
I had to sanitize it, and I talked to Bill Nunn, my assistant with the Steelers, and another friend of mine was a black guy as a coach, and he said, "Look, you're right. They're good stories." He said, "But let someone else fight that battle." So I took all that stuff out.
Interesting. Now, the Steeler emblem on the side of the helmet. Can you? I think a lot of people in Pittsburgh just do not understand or realize what that actually means and why it's just on one side.
Yeah,
of the
what's a
helmet.
hypercycloid? That's the
What's the name of that again?
Hypercycloid.
Okay.
It's like that word that, remember, you corrected me on, and I still can't use it, but a hypercycloid is like a 3 or 4 syllable word that I can use. And it's the steel industry mark, and it represents the steel, the molten steel, the coal and coke and natural gas and that type of stuff. But the reason it's on one side of our helmet, we had an equipment guy, Jackie Hart, was the north side kid, one of our neighbors, and they didn't have it painted on or embossed on there in those days, and it was always getting knocked off. So Jack said, hey, I don't have time to be repasting these things on both sides of the helmet, so he just put it on one side of the helmet, and that's the way it went. That was because the equipment man didn't have time to put it on both sides. And they tried to change it, when you started to get manufactured with it on there. And it says, no, it's a tradition thing. Like we don't have the cheerleaders. My dad fired the cheerleaders. They're going to be nothing but trouble. And they fired the cheerleaders.
But you have Steely McBeam.
Well, he showed up later, and I think the NFL properties or something like that wanted him. And I looked at that thing, and I said, gee, I don't know about that. And the kids love it. The grandkids, all the little kids love that thing.
But the adults don't, I don't think.
Oh, my gosh. What do you think of ever having cheerleaders here? My dad really did fire the cheerleaders. We had, the way the story goes, my dad was in his office at the Roosevelt Hotel, and he and Fogarty shared an office. That was his business manager. And we had this, Point Park College or Robert Morris or someone had the cheerleaders, and they came in, and they were our cheerleaders for a year or two. And the gal came in, the captain of the cheerleader team, and she said, Mr. Rooney, she said, they visited for a while, and she says, our skirts on the field are longer than the skirts we wear, in civilian life. And she jumps up, like it's one of those old Betty Grable movies, show her gams, and show my dad where the skirts were. They were up like, thigh length, and the ones they wore in the field were down below their knee. And Dad said, oh, yeah, okay. And so she left, she departed, this girl, and Dad said, Fogarty said, nice kid. He said, yeah, nice kid, Art. And he said, real nice. He said, fire the cheerleaders. He said, what do you mean fire the cheerleaders? He said, nothing but trouble. Nothing but trouble. I often thought, when we went through that situation with the presidency where, they had the intern, and I thought, how would you like to have my dad or old Harry Truman be in the White House as a president? That situation happened. They would have fired every intern for the next 25 years if they, someone sort of, had that come hither look at them.
So do you think your father's religious background kind of affected his idea of whether to have cheerleaders?
He was a Puritan. He was a prude.
Yeah. So no Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders on the Steelers.
Oh my gosh, no cheerleaders.
Well, were the Steelers always black and gold?
Well, not with the Eagles. We merged with the Eagles during World War II. We did with the Cardinals too, but I don't remember anything. But I know that when we dealt with the Eagles, we wore the green, the green and whatever it was. And my dad said the jerseys are different, but they're still the same old Steelers. SOS. And boy, that lived, because every time we had a bad team, they would say SOS. Same old Steelers.
Now, you grew up on the north side, but
the north side.
The north side. The what?
The north side.
North side. But you have not lived there for quite some time.
47 years.
What do you regard yourself as?
Well, I'm a north sider.
You're a north sider.
Yeah, you can take the boys off the north side, but not the north side off the boys. And it's like my brothers, John, Pat, and Tim. They live in Palm Beach and Greenwich, Connecticut, and some fancy neighborhood in Philadelphia. And you talk to them, and they still sound like Northsiders, and they still talk like Northsiders.
Is your family home still standing, and is it still
in
the family?
Dan lives in our family home. North Lincoln Avenue. He still lives there, and boy, am I glad he did that. I would, rather. Mom always used to say, "Don't sell the old homestead, burn it down." And Dan lives there, and it's really fixed it up. It's sort of a historical place, and he and his wife Pat have done a tremendous job at it. It's a little mansion. It's on Lincoln Avenue they have these huge mansions. It's just a little one.
Did all the kids go to North Catholic?
Yeah, we all went to North Catholic. Yeah, the Marionet's brothers taught us. Yeah.
And what did you get from North Catholic?
We all majored in guilt. I asked my wife's friend went to Seton Hill College with her, and I said, what did you major in at Seton Hill? And she says, I majored in guilt. And it was too good. So someone asked me about North Catholic. I say I majored in guilt.
Well, why don't you explain that for
Well,
people
because
that might not understand that?
everything was an occasion of sin. Girls were occasions of sin. Booze was an occasion of sin. Gambling was an occasion of sin. But so you knew right and wrong, but mostly everything was wrong.
Yeah, that's tough because you're starting to really notice girls in high school. And if they're
What do you mean they actually had girls in high school? We never had. I was never in school with a girl from the 8th grade till I graduated from college. 8 years.
Well, not
high school and college.
Not in your school, but you noticed them out and about.
I guess maybe you did.
Yeah, a little bit. But you went on to St. Vincent.
St. Vincent College. We had any girls there either. Yeah.
So you played sports at both places.
Well, I was a football player at North Catholic, and I participated in football at St. Vincent. I can't. It'd be a lie to say it was any good. As a Scot, I became a Scot, and I learned what it took to play football, and I would have rejected myself. My name wouldn't even made the list. I couldn't even made the scouting list. That's how bad I was.
Well, Mr. Rooney, I've had just a wonderful time sitting and talking with you.
I'm sorry I bounced around, but as Roy McHugh told me, he said, you're like James Joyce. And I said, James Joyce? He said, yeah, the writer. I said, oh yeah, we had him in college, the Irish guy. I said, yeah. And he says, well, he was brilliant. You're not. And he says, and he wrote in stream of consciousness. He says, you do. And he says, Joyce always got to the point. You never get to the point. And he says, you write as you speak. He says, you never ever get to the point. So I'm afraid in our little interview here, you had to remind me where I was, and I bounced around, and it was strictly a non-brilliant James Joyce.
That's quite all right. I've really enjoyed myself, and I thank you for coming and visiting.
Well, thank you. It's a lot of fun to be here with you.
Thank you. And I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed our time we've spent with Mr. Rooney today. Please just remember this. Please be an organ donor and give the gift of life. It's the best gift you could ever give. Thanks again for watching. I'm your host, Lee Adams. Take care, everybody.